Hey guys, I'm here just wanting to talk about something that I think is super important, which is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. More specifically, evidence for it as a historical event. Posted on Facebook a little bit ago that there is good evidence for it, and I think, in this video I can kind of show you that. The reason why the resurrection is important, a good reason for us to study this, is because as Christians, our entire religion hangs on this fact, right? If it's true, then we want to go ahead and believe it. If it's not true, then we need to reject it, and you know we cannot we can't believe it because it's false. But it's not, and I think I'm going to prove that to y'all here today. Um, there's also the fact that if this isn't false, then we have no hope. I mean, think about it. We as Christians have put our entire hope that in this event, and if it's false, then it's pretty sad. We've dedicated our whole lives to it, believing that there's going to be some eternal reward, and if it's not true, then that's a really sad place to be in. I mean, Paul even talks about this in 1 Corinthians, verse 15. Right? He says, if Christ is not risen, your faith is futile. That means it doesn't work. Right? And you are still in your sins. Then also, those who have fallen asleep in Christ have perished. If in this life we only have hope in Christ, we're of all men the most pitiable. So that means, if it's not true, how pitiable, how sad are we? And so the resurrection of Jesus and our faith, Christianity as a whole, they stand and they fall together. You cannot have one without the other. Now, the resurrection is unique. It is unique to Christianity. No other religion has historical evidence to support its supernatural claims, right? We talk about Hinduism, Islam, Mormonism, right? When they're tested, they all fall short of facts, right? If you look at Hindu writings, they say that the Earth has a mountain in the middle of the continents that is 252,000 miles high. I mean, for reference, the moon is only 238,900 miles high, or away. So, I mean, think about it. We wouldn't need space. If this mountain existed, we wouldn't need space shuttles to get to the moon. We could just drive. And that'd be a pretty hefty gas bill. I'm sure there would be toll roads on the way up there. But yeah, the moon would intersect with this mountain. Another reference is that the diameter of the Earth is 8,000 miles. So we're talking about something that is on the Earth, 252,000 miles high, and it is far higher than the Earth itself. The Quran teaches that the sun sets on the Earth in a pool of mud. I mean, that's a testable claim, first off. We could test it a couple of different ways. We can go check all the pools of mud and see if the sun is there. We can also see people in other countries, on the other side of the world, who have sunlight when the sun is set here in the U.S. So Muhammad actually claimed that Alexander the Great was the one who discovered this pool of mud where the sun sets, and he found people living there. I mean, like, I guess the best way to not be Muslim is to read the Quran. The Book of Mormon teaches that Native Americans are primarily descended from Jews. At one point in time, the intro to the Book of Mormon actually said that the Jews were the principal ancestors of the Native Americans. And we obviously have figured out that that's not true. Right? You know, DNA testing has proven this wrong. That's not the link. So now they've actually amended this to say that Jews are among the ancestors of the Native Americans, which is a much lower, lesser type of qualification. Our major historical claim as Christians is the resurrection, and we have some evidence for it. So now, I want to go through 5 historical facts that are not controversial. This isn't some sort of like special Christian revised history. This is stuff that even secular scholars would probably hang with me on and agree. So number 1, if you saw the Facebook post, you know the 5 points that I'm going to talk about, but I'm going to dive into all of them. All right, so number 1 is a death by crucifixion. The ladies find the tomb empty. Number 3 is independent appearances of Jesus alive after death. Violence endured by the disciples, and enemies of the gospel converted. Like I said, they are not controversial. Historians agree on all 5 of these points, whether Christian or secular. So now let's dive into the first one. And if you want a memory aid, that those 5 points actually spell out alive. A, death by crucifixion. L, ladies find the tomb empty. I, independent appearances. V, violence endured. E, enemies of Christ converted, right? Let's dive in. A death by crucifixion. So, I'm going to preface this by saying that if you have a weak stomach, this might be a good place to either click off or maybe mute the video or something, or skip ahead a little, because we're going to really be diving in here. So, I want to look at the crucifixion. I want to look at all of it. Right? So, what happened to Jesus? He was tortured. He was beaten by the Romans in multiple places. The primary weapon that was used was a flagrum. And so this was actually a whip that was made of several braided leather strips of leather with metal balls and pieces of bone woven into them. It was designed to cause deep bruises that would eventually break with every subsequent hit, right? They would hit the same spot over and over and over again, and these bruises would eventually just break open because the skin had just had enough. The pieces of bone would actually tear flesh away. They were designed to where you hit somebody, right? Especially as hard as these guys were hitting somebody who was on the whipping post, and they latch into the skin, and as they pulled it away, it would take skin with it. It was also something that the Romans would actually do. And a lot of people think that Jesus got 29 lashes because in Jewish culture that was mercy, right? 30 minus 1. But he was beaten by the Romans, and so there was no limit. Oftentimes people would die there. I mean, to be honest, I probably would die there. At least by the time they were done, I'd be hoping that I was dead, or soon to be dead. Um, yeah. So then we go to the crucifixion, right? So he's already been beaten. This process is commonly referred to as the half death, because by the time they were done, somebody was literally half dead, and it would speed up what was to happen on the cross later on. So we can look at the crucifixion, and the Romans kind of perfected it. It was actually invented by the Persians, and the Romans took it and they perfected it, or worsened it. However you want to look at it, you know, you can make pretty good arguments on both sides. Um, I mean, they basically their entire their entire motivation for how they did crucifixion was to terrorize their enemies. Like the worst of their criminals, they were they were to be crucified. It was basically to make this as torturous and humiliating and painful and gruesome as possible. Um, and so it was actually so bad that Roman citizens were not allowed to be crucified because it was that bad. But Jews could be. So kind of the process of it was you'd be laid on this cross, and they would send nails, likely not through your hand because there's just nothing here really to hold you up on there, nothing at least strong enough. But they would send it through your wrist, right? And the reason that the Bible says the hand is because if you look at the original language, it means everything from what we know as a hand all the way up to the elbow. So this would all be considered the hand, right? So um, they would usually go. Most historians believe that they would go here, right in this area. And so a couple of things. You've got some bones there that are pretty strong, and you could hang there for a while, right? And they needed it to be a place that was pretty strong because of the fact that um, you were probably going to be there a while, and eventually your legs were going to give out, and so there was needed to be something that would hold you up. There's also the fact, I don't know if they knew this, they probably didn't. We know a lot more about nerves and stuff these days. Um, and but all of you who were those irritating children who knew all the pressure points and would just hit people with them, I was that kid. You know that there's a pressure point here. It's your median nerve. It's right around here. And as you were hanging on the cross, it would just be crushing that median nerve the whole time. But instead of from the outside, like an annoying kid does, it's from the inside, and it's a nail. We also have the nail in his heels. Now, Dr. J.W. Hewitt, in his Harvard Theological Review article, The Use of Nails in the Crucifixion, said that there is astonishingly, this word's hard, I hate this word, there is astonishingly little evidence that the feet of a crucified person were ever pierced by nails. Unfortunately, we actually have a crucified foot, the foot of a crucified person, but these PBS, History Channel, whatever kind of documentaries are never going to look at that kind of stuff. They're always going to try to imply that the Bible is false or misleading, right? So in June of 1968, the Israeli Department of Antiquities and Museums discovered 4 cave tombs just north of Jerusalem. And in what they call ossuary, I think is how you say it, 4, tomb 1, there was a box that was about this big. It's as big as your femur, biggest bone in your body. And it had the remains of a crucified male. They believe it was a male who was crucified. And in there, they found that his shins had been broken, and they also found a 7-inch spike through both of his heels. I'll try to include some of the photos that I found online of this, but basically it's a spike going through. This isn't a foot, but going through the heel, kind of in a sideways, angle. And like I said, both of his shins were broken. They also saw that his shoulders had been dislocated by 6 inches. What's interesting is that in Psalm 22, right, the psalmist actually says, all of my joints are out of, or all of my limbs are out of joint, right? They're actually describing crucifixion 400 years before it was even created. That's pretty awesome. But we have to think about, how did crucifixion really kill someone? Okay, so one of the big things was that they couldn't exhale without standing up, right? So if they were hanging, then they could take in a breath, but they can't exhale without standing up, because they have to be able to open up their lungs, right? Like, have you ever been coughing real bad or something, and you're having trouble catching your breath? So you kind of do this, so that you can kind of breathe better. That what you're doing is you're opening your lungs, right? It was also so painful, right? This process was so painful that they actually had to invent a word for the level of pain endured by someone being crucified. And many of you know what this word is: excruciating, right? That word excruciating literally means out of crucifixion, or out of the cross, right? But then you also had, at least in Jesus' case, the spear, right? The spear that was shoved into his side. And these weren't, I guess it'd be the other side actually, because that's where his heart is. But these weren't just laymen. Like, Romans, from a young age, Roman soldiers were trained killers, right? They were, their whole thing was figuring out how to hurt people and do a really good job of it, right? And so with that, they knew when someone was dead. They were very familiar with it in a way that you and I probably aren't, and that we probably shouldn't be, if we're gonna have any level of mental health. But they knew for a fact when someone was dead, right? And obviously, someone who's maybe in the medical field should know what somebody who's dead looks like, right? It's a lot different than, someone being asleep. You probably know that if you've ever been to, like, a funeral viewing or something, right? You see them and you're like, oh yeah, there's nothing there, right? So these guys knew how to guarantee that someone would die, right? They knew that if you took that spear and shoved it up into them, they were guaranteed to die. And they also knew that blood and water would pour out. They didn't know why, they just knew that this was a sign, right? So the explanations for it, right? The early church, which actually kind of funny, the early church and church fathers and stuff, they didn't know either. They were like, okay, well, what was the blood and water? Was it significant? Was it some sort of message from God? Was it, nope. It's just a medical thing. We know now that, someone's dead and you pierce their heart, pretty good chance blood and water is coming out, right? And there's kind of two reasons, like I said. Either they punctured the pericardium, which is a liquid sac around your heart, or fluid had built up in the lungs from Jesus' inability to. I'm gonna be honest. I don't know what level your lungs are at. I have no idea. I think they're like in your chest, but yeah, basically fluid would build up in the lungs due to his inability to exhale, and you would asphyxiate. You basically suffocate. You choke on basically your own blood. Um, I'm not trying to be graphic for the sake of of graphicness. Is that a word? Um, I'm just trying to be as honest and as clear about this as possible, right? Like, because the fact of the matter is that Jesus was definitely dead. Um, Now we also have to look at his burial, right? He was covered in 75 pounds or more of spices. This was likely to keep the body from smelling too bad, right? Because spices would smell a lot better. There were also security measures taken by the Romans. In Matthew, we see Matthew 20. If you want to just look there, Matthew 27:62, verses 62 through 66. Sorry. On the next day, which followed the day of preparation, the chief priests and Pharisees gathered together to Pilate, saying, "Sir, we remember while he was still alive, how that deceiver said." See, they thought he was a deceiver. They did not believe he was the Christ. How that deceiver said, "After 3 days I will rise." Therefore, command that the tomb be made secure until the third day, lest his disciples come by night and steal him away, and say to the people, "He's risen from the dead." So the last deception will be worse than the first, right? So basically, they're taking security measures, right? They're like, hey, let's make sure they cannot get to this body, right? And so he says, and so Pilate said to them, "You have a guard, go your way, make it as secure as you know how." So they went and made the tomb secure, sealing the stone and setting the guard. So they put this multi-ton stone in place, right? And then they sealed it with a Roman seal. It usually would have been kind of a malleable, sort of clayish kind of material. And if you mess with that seal without government authority, without Roman authorization, it wouldn't be too much longer before you ended up on that cross or dead in some way. You were going to die. Also, this tomb was made of solid rock, right? This wasn't something that you could, you know, great escape out of a spoon or something. This was solid rock. And so there was one way out, one way in. That was the entrance that was sealed by that stone. Now this stone weighed 1.5 to 2 tons. It was usually rolled into place, like you'd have it'd be on kind of a short hill, because it didn't need to go super far usually. It just needed to get in place. And then there was usually a cutout in front of the tomb, like a small cutout just to kind of, it's sort of a break, sort of like a wheel truck. Um, and so, um, but then we also have the Roman guards, right? It was usually 4 to 16 men. They wanted to make absolutely sure nobody was getting in, right? So you've got these trained killers, people who know how to hurt people really well. They know how to kill people and make sure they're dead. And you have 4 to 16 of them. 12 ragtag apostles made up of tax collectors and fishermen are not getting past these guys. These guys, we sometimes hear, well, they fell asleep on post. They would get the death penalty for that. All of this stuff helps our case as Christians looking at the resurrection, right? Because all of this was put into the resurrection of Jesus, or into, sorry, the crucifixion of Jesus. All this work was put in not only to the crucifixion, right? Actually, the crucifixion itself really um, wasn't that insane. Like it wasn't that uncommon. The kind of the path he took, um, really, except for the crown of thorns, it wasn't it wasn't really, you know, unusual. Sorry, I had to answer a text message. Um, but like I was saying, Jesus's crucifixion, like the path that he took, really wasn't that abnormal. It was pretty standard for the time. You know, whipping post was pretty standard. The crown of thorns obviously was not. That was more of a mockery thing. But again, the ability to cause pain and speed up death. Um, but then you also have the excuse me. But then the whipping post, pretty standard. Again, that was referred to as the half death. Um, and then they'd have to carry their cross to the to Golgotha, and then they would have to be crucified, which is exactly what happened to Jesus. It's mainly things that happened after the crucifixion that um, that were a little bit different, other than the tomb and the stone, right? Putting the Roman seal on it, putting the guards in front of it, right? You know, historians say that there was likely close to 16, anywhere between 4 and 16. But historians say that it's likely more like 16 guards. In other words, 16 trained killers, right? And if they fell asleep, they would be killed. So this all, again, helps our case as Christians. Now, maybe you're thinking, hey, you're just using the Bible to prove the Bible, right? I'm not, because we actually do see this outside of the Bible. We have first century non-Christian historians, right? People who were chronologically close to this event, right? Josephus, who was born in 37 AD, so that would have been, I'm bad at math, 4 years after Jesus' birth, death, and resurrection. He was a Roman historian, right? So as a Roman, it actually wouldn't even help him out to say that this happened, right? But he writes, at this time there was a wise man who was called Jesus, and his conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous, and many people from among the Jews and the other nations became his disciples. Pilate, talking about Pontius Pilate, condemned him to be crucified and to die. And those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them after his crucifixion and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders. We also have a guy by the name of Tacitus, 55 AD, so a little further out from Josephus, but not too far. What is that, like 13? Again, bad at math. 20 something years. Somebody who's better at math, help me out. But Tacitus talks about it. Jewish Talmud talks about it. And these are hostile sources to the resurrection, right? They're not people who actually believe it, or who would have anything to gain, I should say, from believing it. They're just saying what people in the day are saying. So we know for a fact that the crucifixion of Jesus really did happen. It's firmly established, and New Testament historians are convinced that it happened. Like everyone agrees. Like everyone agrees that Jesus was crucified. A guy by the name of John Mayer, not the guitar player, a a historical Jesus scholar. He says, for two obvious reasons, practically, no one today would deny that Jesus was executed by crucifixion. This central event is recorded or alluded to not only by the vast majority of New Testament authors, but also by Josephus and Tacitus. He even sorts those. Cites those sources. Such an embarrassing event created a major obstacle to converting Jews and Gentiles alike that the church struggled to overcome. Uh, that's from the Journal of Biblical Literature in 1987. So now we can go ahead and look at number 2. Ladies find the tomb empty. Right, that's the L in our ALIVE acronym or mnemonic device or whatever you want to call it, memory aid. All right, so yeah, ladies find the tomb empty. All right. So now Luke 24 gives this account. Now, on the first day of the week, very early in the morning, they and certain other women with them came to the tomb, bringing the spices which they had prepared. But they found the stone rolled away from the tomb. Then they went in and did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. And it happened as they were greatly perplexed about this, that behold, 2 men stood by them in shining garments. Then, as they were afraid and bowed their faces to the earth, they said to them, why do you seek the living among the dead? He's not here, but he is risen. Remember how he spoke to you when he was still in Galilee, saying, the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men and be crucified, and the third day rise again. And they remembered his words. Then they returned from the tomb and told all these things to the 11 and all the rest. It was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the other women with them, who told these things to the apostles. And they gladly received it and rejoiced because they completely believed them, because women are super well respected in first century Jewish culture. Oh wait, no, I think I read that wrong. And their words seemed to them like idle tales, and they did not believe them. Remember, these guys, their entire experience with death was the same that you and I have. Somebody dies, they stay dead, right? So they didn't believe them. Also, they had this mentality of, these are women, they miss Jesus, so do we, but like they're going a little crazy. Like they're just making stuff up because they really loved Jesus. And so they thought they were crazy, right? It kind of hurt the gospel, which we'll explore in a minute, but it helps us now, right? So first off, the women were the first to find the tomb and the first to see Jesus alive. They were unlikely witnesses, right? If you're wanting to spread a lie, right? You in that time you don't want it to be women. That's embarrassing, actually, right? It's what historians actually call the criterion of embarrassment, right? If I want to make you think that I'm telling the truth, right? If I want to prove to you that I'm telling the truth, I'm going to tell you something embarrassing about myself, right? And you're more likely to believe me. Whereas if I tell you how great and wonderful I am, you're maybe going to have your doubts, right? So they're unlikely witnesses, and it hurts the credibility of the story. They were actually also mocked by their contemporaries, right? Again, they were just like, these women, they're crazy, you know how women are, right? That was kind of the attitude that they had. As we already saw, the disciples did not believe them. They were like, "Hey, people stay dead. Like we saw him die. No, he's not alive, right?" And so, because of that criterion of embarrassment, that actually kind of helps prove the story true. Um, because a Jewish lie would not have started that way at that time, right? Um, so yeah, that there's not a whole lot to be said there. I've kind of just said everything I feel like can be said there. But yeah, in first century Jewish culture, the fact that women found the empty tomb and they were the first ones to report it to anybody, that's kind of that's embarrassing for the disciples and for the early church, right? Because in they're very man-centric views, and they're very, you know, I mean, use a contemporary word, they're misogynistic culture. They they just were not ready to believe women, especially with such an outlandish claim. So yeah, and by the way, this criterion of embarrassment, historians actually look for that kind of stuff. So yeah, we can go ahead and move on to number three, which is the I in our alive memory aid, which is independent appearances of Jesus alive after death, right? And so in First Corinthians 15, um, there's actually some really important stuff about this passage. Um, One thing in particular that I'm going to share with you all here in a minute, but let's just go ahead and read it. First Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 through 8. For I delivered to you first of all that which I also received. This is Paul, the Apostle Paul, writing. That Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he rose again the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he was seen by Cephas, then by the 12. After that, he was seen by over 500 brethren at once, of whom the greater part remain to the present, but some have fallen asleep. After that, he was seen by James, then by all the apostles. Then, last of all, he was seen by me also, as one born out of due time. And so, one of the big things about this passage, right, is that many people, it basically details that many people were eyewitnesses of Jesus alive after death, right? He says, he names a few of them even, right? And one of the big things is that these people were still alive, right? You know, like not only were they still alive, but they also they also were in the area, right? Hey, this like if I live in Hutto, so the worst place for me to start a lie, right, would be or a lie about something that happened in Hutto would be in Hutto, right? Because you got people there who could be like, yeah, no, you're crazy, right? Um, but that didn't happen, right? The better thing for me to do would be to say, oh yeah, hey, over in Pennsylvania, I did this, right? You know what I mean? Because there's no one around that's going to be able to corroborate or like disprove the story, right? Um, but the important part that I wanted to touch on about this First Corinthians 15, it is probably, specifically this passage, is probably the oldest part of your New Testament Bible. So scholars and historians actually date this passage to within 5 years of the crucifixion, right? And so When we look at that, that means that there were people still alive. There were people in the area. Um, you know, it was very, very much, a disprovable thing if it was a lie. There were plenty of people who could have come behind and just been like, yeah, no, that's not true. Also, the fact that they could have produced this, they can't talk. They could have produced Jesus's body, right? They could have been like, hey, here's his body. Stop talking about this crazy resurrection that y'all are on about, right? And this all points towards a physical resurrection. There's also evidences of the women who, the female disciples, right? They saw him alive after finding the empty tomb. They also held his feet and they worshipped him. He actually says, "Don't cling to me," right? Like I've got stuff to do. Like you can touch me. That you can. I believe the Bible actually says they handled him, but meaning that they touched him, right? You can't touch a ghost. You can't touch a hallucination, most likely. Um, but yeah, they they interacted with him, right? It's evidence of a physical resurrection, right? And we've also got the 10. We also got 10 of the apostles. Um, in Luke 24, verse 36, we get through 43. We get now as they said these things, Jesus himself stood in the midst of them and said to them, "Peace to you." But they were terrified and frightened and supposed that they had seen a spirit. Right? These guys, they were actually more willing, like they were more quickly willing to believe that they had seen a ghost before they were going to believe that someone had resurrected from the dead. Right? And he said to them, "Why are you troubled, and why do doubts arise in your hearts? Behold my hands and my feet, that it is I myself. Handle me and see, for a spirit does not have flesh and bones as you see I have." When he had said this, he showed them his hands and his feet, but while they still did not believe for joy and marveled, he said to them, "Have you any food here?" So they gave him a piece of broiled fish and some honeycomb, and he took it and ate it in their presence. So, what does that mean? Do you think that Jesus asked? Do you think that Jesus asked for food because he was like hungry? I mean, maybe he was. I mean, he hadn't eaten in a few days, on account of being dead. He likely hadn't eaten in a few days, so he probably was kind of hungry. I mean, if we're being totally honest. But also, this is another proof because if you look at it, he, um, you know, a ghost isn't gonna eat. A hallucination isn't going to eat. You may see them eat in the hallucination, but when the hallucination is over, the food will still be there. So yeah, he took it and he ate it in their presence, which a ghost can't do. So some evidences that we have of a physical resurrection that we kind of already touched on. He let them touch him. He ate with them, and so what could this be other than a legitimate resurrection? And one thing we know is that Thomas didn't see him. Like honestly, I kind of we call him doubting Thomas, right? Because he doubted for like 5 minutes. I mean, he ends up dying for this gospel, dying, literally dying for preaching that Jesus resurrected. But all he's remembered for is the doubt. That's wild. But Jesus takes care of the doubt. He appears to him in John 20. After 8 days, his disciples were again inside, and Thomas with them. Jesus came, the doors being shut, and stood in the midst and said, "Peace to you." Then he said to Thomas, "Reach your finger here and look at my hands, and reach your hand here and put it into my side. Do not be unbelieving, but believing." And Thomas answered and said to him, "My Lord and my God." There's only one subject. There's only one person, one human person that Thomas would have said that to, and that is the Messiah, who he is seeing and feeling has been resurrected. Jesus said to him, "Thomas, because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." So basically, the idea is that, you know, is that, hey Thomas, it's really good that you believe now, but you should have believed their testimony. Um, so yeah, he says like you should have believed their testimony, but I'm really happy you believe now. He also appeared to, as the scripture says, 500 at once. Again, 1 Corinthians 15:6. After that, he was seen by over 500 brethren at once, of whom the greater part remain to the present, but some have fallen asleep. Right? And like we touched on a minute ago, they could have tested this claim. Right? It's a verifiable thing. If you find one or two out of that 500 who say, "Yeah, we saw him," boom, there we go. Right? And because of the fact that this was written within 5 years of the crucifixion, most of them were still alive. Paul even says that most of them are still alive. Right? This is another thing that historians look for. They look for how closely the accounts are given from the time that the event actually took place. Right? As I touched on before, this started in Jerusalem. Right? Acts 1, we get, to whom he also presented himself alive after his suffering by many infallible proofs, being seen by them during 40 days and speaking of the things pertaining to the kingdom of God. Right? This would have been, right, starting a lie in the area where the lie took place would have been a terrible, terrible idea. Um, now, very few disagree with this third point of independent appearances of Jesus, right? The vast majority of historians believe all of these to be true based on normal ways of verifying a historical claim, right? Documents, eyewitness appearances, that kind of stuff, right? So yeah. Now, number 4, we are going to get into a little bit more of the violence, because this is violence endured by the apostles. So again, this is stuff we need to know, but again, if you've got a weak stomach, maybe skip this part. Although I do think it would benefit, I do think that there would be benefit in going ahead and sticking around for it. So yeah, violence endured by the apostles. So when Jesus was alive and with them, they didn't have the courage or conviction to face death, right? Um, Jesus Jesus even called them, "Oh, you of little faith," right? Because they needed to see things to believe, right? Also, when he was crucified, they scattered. They went off to They didn't think he was coming back. They went back to their jobs. Some of them laid low because they were like, "Hey, I don't want anyone to see me." Peter even denied knowing Jesus 3 times. Peter, right? They were all depressed, discouraged. They were terrified. Um, Many of them hid in the upper room with the door locked. Um, but something happened in their lives that changed them from cowering deserters to confident martyrs. And it happened after Jesus' death. Because the apostles proclaimed the resurrection of Jesus despite severe persecution and personal sacrifice, even to the point of death. Right? And you may say, well, people die for less all of the time. Right? Even today. But here's the thing. Most of these people, not eyewitnesses. Right? We got to remember, these are guys who saw it happen. It wasn't just something passed down to them. This was something that they claimed they saw with their own, like, physical eyes. The eyes, jammed into their skulls. They saw it. And there's also the fact that when people knowingly lie, it's also because of some perceived benefit, right? They have some idea that things are gonna work out in their favor, right? I mean, you can imagine the conversation between Peter and Paul. Peter goes to Paul and it's just like, hey, I know you're persecuting Christians, but look, we're gonna spread the lie that Jesus actually did resurrect. And Paul's like, why would we do that? Peter's like, for all the benefits. And Paul's like, are you going to get really rich? Well, I mean, no. I'm actually in abject poverty, and I've lost, my lands have been taken away, and no one will give me a job. Yeah, but, we're going to get girls, right? Like, we're going to get, women, right? Well, no, we actually have we've got pretty strict rules about that. Um, there's not going to be any of that kind of stuff. And Paul's like, oh, but we'll be like famous, like rock stars, right? Actually, we'll be infamous, and we're going to be hunted down and killed for this. And then Paul's just like, all right, I'm in. Let's do it. There was no benefit to this, right? But having been eyewitnesses of Jesus' resurrection, they would have known if it was a lie. But all they gained by this lie was death. And the deaths that they gained were incredible, brutal deaths. Right? And some of the sources that we've got are church fathers. We've got the Bible. We've also got Josephus who details it. And we can actually go ahead and go through some of the ways that all of them died. So Matthew was killed with a sword for preaching in Ethiopia. The apostle Mark died in Alexandria, which is northern Egypt, after being dragged through the city. Luke was hung to death on an olive tree in Greece. James was beheaded in Jerusalem. We see that in Acts. James the Less was thrown from the temple wall, and then because he wasn't already dead, he was stoned to death. Philip was hanged in Phrygia. Bartholomew, we'll get to Peter in a minute, but Bartholomew, I think, had the worst death. He was flayed alive. That means that he was skinned alive. Like, if you've ever seen the movie Braveheart, where Mel Gibson's character, uh, William Wallace, gets tortured before he's killed, and the executioner brings out that knife roll with like a bunch of knives, daggers, and like hooks and stuff, and he like peels flesh from I think his stomach. Yeah, that's what happened to him, except for his whole body. All that Bartholomew would have had to do was say, "Hey, it's all a lie. I take it back," but he didn't. Andrew was bound to a cross with ropes and left to die of exposure. Jude was shot to death with arrows. Thomas was run through with a spear in East India. There's actually a monument to him there today, or a memorial. Matthias was stoned and then beheaded. Barnabas was stoned to death by Jews in Thessalonica. Paul was beheaded in Rome. Peter was crucified, just as Jesus prophesied. We know that Peter, was crucified upside down. And none of them stopped preaching that they were witnesses of the resurrection. I mean, these were all terrible ways to go, especially Bartholomew. But none of them stopped preaching that they were witnesses of the resurrection. And there is no rational basis to say that they knew that they were lying. And point number 5, is the E in our alive memory aid. Enemies of Christ converted. James and Jude, remember they were the brothers of Jesus, right? John 7:5 actually says, "For even his brothers did not believe him, that he was the Messiah." I mean, think about it. Before the crucifixion, when Jesus taught and worked his miracles, they actually mocked him. But after the resurrection, they were radical Christians. But you got to think about it. I mean, these were the brothers of Jesus. What would it take for your sibling to convince you that they're the Messiah, right? Like, I mean, sometimes we just don't want to think about that our siblings are doing great things, or that they're older than like 7, right? And so, I mean, the way I see this is that James and Jude would have been like, "All right, Jesus, come on, dude, like you're not the Messiah. Come on, bro, like stop. You're this is going from pretend to blasphemy very quickly. You need to cut this out." But then they became Christians. There needed to be something that convinced them that their brother was actually the Messiah. The next one is Saul, who became Paul. Right? To me, it's probably the most impressive conversion of all, because of the fact that he was going around killing Christians. Right? There's actually pretty good evidence that he was there at the stoning of Stephen. Right? He was a massive persecutor of the church. Right? He was trying to tear it down. Right? And but something happened, right? And he didn't claim that it was a change of heart or anything like that. He claimed an experience of seeing the risen Christ. Right? I mean, think about it. One of the great things about Jesus is that he makes his enemies into his friends. It's great. So, looking at all of these facts of history, the resurrection of Christ is the most rational way to account for all of them. Like, there's no other rational explanation, right? So, again, a death by crucifixion, ladies find the tomb empty, independent appearances of Jesus alive after death, violence endured by the apostles, enemies of Christ converted. Okay. If we look at all of that, what do we get? We get that Jesus is alive. He truly is resurrected, right? I mean, there's other factors that support the resurrection, which we don't have time to cover, but because this video is entirely too long, but you know, it's this is all good stuff. But you know, things that the prophecies that Christ fulfilled, the miraculous rise of Christianity, influence of Jesus after his death, the countless people who still claim that he's alive, the evidence of their changed lives which they credit to the living Jesus. Right? So, what reason could anyone have for not believing? A couple of them are that they decide ahead of time that God can't do that. And no evidence would convince that person. In this case, it's kind of just the same case as the duck-billed platypus. Let me explain. So, way back when, some European explorers, they found the duck-billed platypus. And they were like, man, this doesn't fit into anything we've got. It lays eggs, but it's got fur, but it swims in the water, and it looks like a duck in its face. Like, what's going on? And they wrote back to Europe about it, and they were like, hey, we found this crazy thing. And they were like, yeah, no, you're making it up. It's not real. So they were like, okay, well, here, we'll kill one and send a pelt to them. So they sent the pelt, and and it gets there, and the people who receive it are like, yeah, I think this is a forgery. This isn't real. This is something that they fabricated. So they're like, okay, we can't. We told you about it. We've shown you a pelt. So when they come back, guess what they do? They steal a duck-billed platypus, and they take it back to Europe, and they still don't believe that it's real. They literally are looking at a real live duck-billed platypus, and they still don't believe it's real. No evidence could convince that person. But yeah, I just wanted to make this video, and if you do have questions, please drop them in the comments. If you stayed for the whole thing, thank you. Very important that you did. With Easter being tomorrow, or at the time that I put this video up, it'll be tomorrow. I'm filming it Friday night. But yeah, that's all I've got. So, um, yeah, y'all have a great day. I hope y'all have a great Easter. If you've got any questions or want to talk or anything like that, like I said, comment on the video, or you can even message me if you want. I'd be happy to go through more if you would like. But yeah, thank you for sticking around.